In January of 1917, a newspaper reporter named Captain W.S. Ray traveled to the small town of Idabel, Oklahoma, to interview a woman who claimed to be over 100 years old. Her name was Elvira Shoals. She had been brought to testify in a court case, and when the reporter met her on the street, he found her hale and hearty, in full possession of her mental faculties, moving with the energy of someone decades younger. She had a story to tell, one that stretched back to the earliest days of the American Republic, through the horrors of slavery, through the Trail of Tears, through the Civil War, and into a new century where she still waited for the freedom she had been promised. This is the story of Elvira Shoals. When Americans think about slavery, they typically picture the cotton plantations of the Deep South, white planters in columned mansions, and the brutal system that built the wealth of states like Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. What most people do not know is that slavery existed far beyond those boundaries, in places and among peoples that complicate the simple narratives we have inherited. One of those places was the Chickasaw Nation. And one of those stories belongs to Elvira Shoals, who was born into bondage not under a white master, but under one of the most powerful and wealthy Native American leaders of the early 19th century, a man named George Colbert. To understand Elvira's story, we first need to understand the world into which she was born, and the man who owned her. The Chickasaw people had inhabited the lands of what is now northern Mississippi, northwestern Alabama, western Tennessee, and southwestern Kentucky for centuries before European contact. They were a powerful nation, skilled warriors who had successfully resisted Spanish, French, and British attempts at domination. In 1540, when the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto led his expedition through the American southeast, he encountered the Chickasaw and stayed in their principal town. The encounter was not friendly. The Chickasaw attacked De Soto's forces, killing a number of Spaniards and driving the expedition from their territory. It was a pattern that would repeat itself for more than 2 centuries. The Chickasaw would fight, and the Chickasaw would survive. By the 18th century, the Chickasaw had established themselves as crucial players in the complex diplomacy of the colonial Southeast. They allied with the British against the French and fought numerous wars against the Choctaw, their traditional rivals. They acquired firearms and European trade goods, and they adapted their society to the changing world around them. One of the most significant adaptations was the emergence of a class of mixed heritage leaders who could navigate both native and European cultures. These men, born to European traders and Chickasaw women, would come to dominate Chickasaw politics during the most turbulent period in the nation's history. George Colbert was born around 1764 in what is now northern Alabama in the heart of Chickasaw territory. His father was James Logan Colbert, a Scottish trader who had migrated to North America and established himself among the Chickasaw people around 1740. James Colbert lived in the Muscle Shoals area for roughly 40 years, and during that time he married 3 high-ranking Chickasaw women in succession. Chickasaw chiefs and high-status women found such marriages strategically beneficial, as they gave the tribe advantages with traders and helped secure access to European goods that were becoming increasingly essential to survival. George's mother was Minta Hoy, James Colbert's second wife, a Chickasaw woman whose clan was one from which hereditary chiefs were traditionally drawn. The Chickasaw practiced a matrilineal system of kinship, meaning that children inherited their status and clan membership through their mothers, not their fathers. This was fundamentally different from the European patrilineal system, and it had profound implications for the Colbert children. Despite having a Scottish father, George Colbert was fully Chickasaw in the eyes of his people. He belonged to his mother's clan, and through her lineage, he was eligible for positions of leadership that would have been closed to him in white American society. Property and hereditary leadership passed through the maternal line, and the mother's eldest brother was the main male mentor of children, especially of boys. This meant that George and his brothers grew up with strong connections to Chickasaw traditions, while also learning the language and customs of their father's world. James Logan Colbert fathered at least 7 sons, of whom 6 survived to adulthood. William, George, Levi, Samuel, Joseph, and James Colbert would come to dominate Chickasaw politics for nearly a century. They grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable speaking Chickasaw and English, equally at home in a tribal council meeting and in negotiations with American officials. This gave them enormous advantages in the tumultuous decades ahead, when the Chickasaw would face relentless pressure from the expanding United States. The Colbert brothers became the primary interpreters, negotiators, and spokesmen for their people, and they accumulated significant wealth and power in the process. Because of the status of their mothers, the Colbert Chickasaw sons and their descendants provided critical leadership during the tribe's greatest challenges. George Colbert distinguished himself early as a warrior and leader. During the American Revolution, he and his brothers initially supported the British, as their father had been a loyal British subject. But after the Revolution, they pragmatically shifted their allegiance to the new American nation. George fought alongside American forces during the Northwest Indian Wars of the 1790s, serving under Generals Arthur St. Clair in 1791 and Anthony Wayne in 1794. In recognition of his service, George and his brother William, along with another Chickasaw chief named Piomingo, received Silver Peace Medals and military uniforms from President George Washington in 1792. George met Washington personally in 1794, establishing connections to the highest levels of American power that would serve him well in the decades to come. During the Creek War of 1813 to 1814, George Colbert raised a force of 350 Chickasaw warriors and fought under Andrew Jackson against the Red Stick faction of the Creek Nation. He participated in the Battle of the Holy Ground in December 1813 and the decisive Battle of Horseshoe Bend in March 1814. His military exploits gave him influence in the tribal council and connections to Jackson, who would later become the architect of Indian removal. It was a bitter irony that would haunt the Chickasaw people. The same Jackson who had relied on Chickasaw warriors to defeat the Creek would later force the Chickasaw from their homeland. But George Colbert was not just a warrior. He was also a shrewd businessman who understood how to profit from the changing world around him. By the early 1800s, he had established Colbert's Ferry near Cherokee, Alabama, at a crucial crossing of the Tennessee River along the Natchez Trace. The Natchez Trace was one of the most important roads in early America, a roughly 440-mile route connecting Nashville, Tennessee, to Natchez, Mississippi. It had been used for centuries by native peoples and by the herds of buffalo and deer that migrated between the salt licks of central Tennessee and the grasslands along the Mississippi River. Prehistoric animals had followed the dry ground of the trace to distant grazing lands, and Native American hunting parties had followed the well-worn trail for generations. When American expansion accelerated after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, the trace became a vital commercial artery. President Thomas Jefferson, seeking to secure American control of the Mississippi Valley, authorized the improvement of the road. In 1801, the U.S. Army began widening the route, making it navigable by wagon. Traders from Kentucky and Tennessee, known as cane tucks, would float their goods down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans, sell their cargo and their flatboats for lumber, and then walk back home along the Natchez Trace. At its peak, more than 10,000 travelers made this journey every year. The route was dangerous, plagued by bandits and difficult terrain, and the crossing of the Tennessee River was considered one of the worst natural obstacles on the entire trace. George Colbert controlled that crossing. In 1801, following negotiations with General James Wilkinson, who had been tasked by Jefferson with improving the trace, Colbert secured exclusive rights to operate a ferry across the Tennessee River. He was shrewd enough to make Wilkinson promise to pay all expenses for constructing the ferry boat, cabins, stables, and a kitchen to serve travelers. From 1802 to 1819, Colbert's ferry carried mail, militia, settlers, Indians, and renegades over what was considered by many travelers as the worst natural obstacle on the trace. The quarter-mile breadth of the powerful Tennessee River was a formidable barrier, and George Colbert charged whatever the market would bear. Colbert was notorious for his high fees. One contemporary described him as shrewd, talented, and wicked. A traveling preacher who stayed at Colbert's stand recorded that characterization in his journal, and it captured the essential truth about George Colbert. He understood power, and he knew how to use his position to his advantage. According to widely repeated accounts, when Andrew Jackson needed to ferry his army across the Tennessee River after the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, Colbert charged him $75,000 for the service. Whether that specific figure is accurate or not, it captures the scale of Colbert's ambitions and the leverage he wielded over travelers who had no other way to cross the river. Alongside his ferry operation, Colbert ran an inn or stand that provided food and lodging to travelers. One guest described spending the night in an outbuilding with no fewer than 50 Indians, many of them drunk. The Natchez Trace was a rough and lawless place, and Colbert's stand was one of the few islands of relative security in a wilderness filled with danger. Meriwether Lewis, of Lewis and Clark fame, stopped at Colbert's Ferry in October 1809, just days before his mysterious death at Grinder's Stand, further along the trace. The ornithologist Alexander Wilson, who traveled to the trace to investigate Lewis's death, recorded his frustration with the ferry in terms that would be familiar to any modern traveler leaving a bad review. The ferry was an aggravation and a humiliation, he wrote, and the prices were outrageous. But the ferry and the inn were only part of Colbert's empire. He was also a cotton planter who owned significant agricultural lands in Mississippi and Alabama. He married 2 Cherokee women, both daughters of Chief Doublehead, and fathered 6 sons and 2 daughters. His extended family, including his brothers and their descendants, became wealthy merchant planters with large livestock holdings and fields of cotton and corn. And, like the white planters whose lifestyle they emulated, George Colbert and his brothers depended on enslaved labor to work their fields and maintain their households. The Chickasaw, like the other peoples who would become known as the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, had adopted slavery as their contact with European and American society increased. The label 5 civilized tribes was applied by white Americans who saw these nations adopting European-style agriculture, written constitutions, and Christianity. Part of that so-called civilization included the ownership of enslaved African Americans. By the late 18th century, when more than 500,000 Africans were enslaved in the American South, All 5 of these nations had come to include both enslaved black people and small numbers of free African Americans. Some had come as runaways seeking refuge in Indian communities. Others had been purchased by native peoples who saw economic advantage in adopting the plantation system that was making their white neighbors wealthy. The forms of slavery varied among the different tribes. The Creek and Seminole often intermarried with their slaves and allowed them considerable freedoms. The Cherokee resisted intermarriage but generally maintained less brutal conditions than the cotton plantations of the Deep South. The Choctaw and Chickasaw, however, more closely approximated the system of white slaveholders. Their slaves worked primarily as agricultural laborers, cultivating cotton for their master's profit and food for consumption. Some were skilled workers, seamstresses, blacksmiths, and domestic servants. Indian slaveholders bought and sold slaves, often doing business with white slaveholders in the neighboring states of Texas and Arkansas. They passed slave codes that protected owners' property rights and restricted the freedoms of enslaved people. The black people owned as slaves by the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek were mostly owned by either intermarried whites or their mixed-blood descendants. In the southern United States, the system of chattel slavery conferred a vast amount of power and influence on slave owners and shaped the destiny of the country. It was no different among the 5 tribes. Wealthy slaveholders dominated tribal governments, and their economic interests shaped tribal policy. George Colbert owned an estimated 150 enslaved people. His plantation near the Tennessee River depended on their labor, and when he traveled, enslaved workers accompanied him. The National Park Service, which today maintains the Natchez Trace Parkway, describes Colbert and his family as one of many slaveholding planters that emerged among the Chickasaw during this time period. Evidence of Colbert's slaveholding practices survives in scattered historical documents. In April 1823, George Colbert placed an advertisement in a newspaper seeking 3 runaway slaves. One was named Trouble, about 55 years old and African-born. The other 2, Philip and July, were both described as bilingual speakers of Chickasaw and English, suggesting they had been raised among the Chickasaw from childhood. The advertisement offers a glimpse into the world of slavery in the Chickasaw Nation, where enslaved people learned native languages and customs even as they remained property, subject to pursuit and recapture if they dared to flee. It was into this world that Elvira Shoals was born. In her 1917 interview, she stated plainly that she was born a slave, the property of old George Colbert, and was raised below Tuscumbia, Alabama. Tuscumbia sits along the Tennessee River, near the famous Muscle Shoals, the stretch of rapids and rocky outcroppings that gave the region its name. The Colbert Shoals, named for the family that dominated the area, were just downstream. Elvira grew up in a landscape marked by the Colbert name, surrounded by a world that existed to serve the interests of her masters. We do not know the exact year of her birth, or the names of her parents, or the circumstances of her early childhood. The historical record for enslaved people is always fragmentary, built from the scattered documents that slaveholders left behind and the memories that survivors carried with them. What we do know is that Elvira was young when her world was turned upside down, when the Chickasaw people were forced to leave their ancestral homeland and march westward into exile. The removal of the Chickasaw began in 1837 and continued until 1850, part of the larger catastrophe that would become known as the Trail of Tears. President Andrew Jackson, the same man who had once fought alongside George Colbert against the Creek, had championed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which authorized the federal government to negotiate treaties that would exchange native lands in the Southeast for territory west of the Mississippi River. The law was framed as voluntary, but the reality was coercion and violence. Jackson saw the United States as vulnerable to foreign invasion, particularly from the Gulf area. He wanted to secure the lower Mississippi Valley and populate the southern states along the Gulf with Americans, as he did not trust the Indians. State governments extended their jurisdiction over native lands, outlawed tribal governments, and encouraged white settlers to encroach on Indian territory. In 1832, after the state of Mississippi declared its jurisdiction over the Chickasaw Indians, outlawing tribal self-governance, Chickasaw chiefs assembled at the National Council House and signed the Treaty of Pontotoc Creek, ceding their remaining Mississippi territory to the United States and agreeing to find land and relocate west of the Mississippi River. The message was clear: leave or be destroyed. The Chickasaw resisted as long as they could. Levi Colbert, George's brother and the principal chief, understood the impossible position his people faced. In a letter to President Jackson, he acknowledged that the Chickasaw had agreed to sell their land to put down that bitter question of state sovereignty, to keep peace with the white family, to preserve the Union whose friendship and protection the Chickasaw wanted. It was a bitter concession, but Levi Colbert was a pragmatist. He negotiated the best terms he could, securing more than $500,000 in compensation for Chickasaw lands, and establishing a system by which individual Chickasaw would receive allotments that they could sell before departure. Unlike the Cherokee, who were rounded up by federal troops and forced to march at bayonet point, the Chickasaw managed to maintain some control over their removal. They paid for their own transportation, $30 plus a per diem for each person, hiring contractors and purchasing supplies. They sold their individual land holdings before departure and carried the proceeds with them. This policy demonstrated their unity and love for their people, but money could not protect them from disease, from the exhaustion of the journey, from the grief of leaving everything they had ever known. In 1836, at Dokesville, near Fort Towson, the Chickasaw agreed to pay $530,000 to the Choctaw for the central and western portion of the Choctaw region in southern Indian Territory. When the main body of Chickasaw gathered at Memphis, Tennessee on July 4, 1837, they brought with them everything they could carry: their belongings, their livestock, and their enslaved African Americans. 3,001 Chickasaw crossed the Mississippi River that summer, following routes that the Choctaw and Creek had established before them. They traveled by boat and by wagon, by horse and on foot, through swamps and across prairies, toward a destination most of them had never seen. More than 500 Chickasaw died during the journey, victims of dysentery, smallpox, and the accumulated traumas of displacement. The slaves who accompanied them performed much of the physical labor involved in removal. They loaded wagons, cleared roads, led teams of livestock, and buried the dead. They shared the hardships of the journey while remaining property, human beings whose suffering was counted as part of someone else's losses. A few slaves escaped during the confusion of removal, but most had no choice but to follow their owners into the unknown. By 1837, 46,000 Indians from the southeastern states had been removed from their homelands, opening 25 million acres for white settlement. More than 4,000 slaves and other people of African descent accompanied them on the trek westward. Elvira Shoals was among them. In her interview, she recalled that she was about grown when she left Tennessee, which would place her birth sometime in the late 1810s or early 1820s. She was moved to this county with the Indians when they came here, she told the reporter, referring to the area around Idabel in what is now McCurtain County, Oklahoma. She had spent her childhood in Alabama in the shadow of the Colbert family's power, and now she was being carried into a new land, still enslaved, still the property of the people who had owned her since birth. The journey must have been terrifying and disorienting, a forced march into an unfamiliar landscape with no guarantee of survival. George Colbert himself did not survive to see his people settled in their new home. After Levi Colbert died in 1834, before removal began, George reluctantly succeeded him as principal chief and primary negotiator, because he was bilingual and bicultural. He signed the Treaty of Washington on May 24, 1834, which provided permanent reservations for the Colbert family and other mixed bloods, and created a tribal commission to monitor and approve Chickasaw land sales. But his health was failing, and he never reached the Chickasaw section of Oklahoma, which the Chickasaw called Oklahoma, meaning red waters. George Colbert died on November 7, 1839, near Fort Towson in Indian Territory. He was approximately 75 years old, and he had spent the last years of his life watching everything he had built slip away. His ferry, his plantation, his political influence, all of it had been left behind in Alabama. He moved west with his family and 150 enslaved people, trying to rebuild in a strange land, but his health failed before he could complete the journey. Colbert County, Alabama, is named after both him and his brother Levi, a lasting monument to their influence in their homeland. But for the people he had owned, his death changed nothing. They remained enslaved, passed down to his heirs like any other property. The Colbert family's ferry business continued in Indian Territory. Benjamin Colbert received the contract to operate a ferry on the Red River between Oklahoma and Texas, and eventually became rich serving the Butterfield stagecoach line, ferrying military troops and serving cattle drives. His prices were even higher than the original ferry across the Tennessee. Elvira's experience after George Colbert's death illustrates the fragmented nature of enslaved people's lives. She told the reporter that she lived with Colbert at Colbert's Ferry on Red River until he died. After George Colbert's death, Elvira passed to his daughter Susan, who married a man named Jones. "We went to live at Scullyville," Elvira recalled. "That was no place then, just name. From there we moved to Rose Hill, above Dokesville. She belonged to Jones when she was freed." These fragments of memory trace a geography of bondage, a series of places where Elvira labored and survived while waiting for a freedom that seemed like it would never come. Scullyville and Dokesville were early settlements in the Choctaw Nation, places where the infrastructure of Indian Territory was slowly being built by the labor of the enslaved. The Chickasaw Nation that emerged in Indian Territory was built on the same foundations as the society they had left behind. Initially, they were combined with the Choctaw Nation, and their area was called the Chickasaw District. In 1855, the Chickasaw separated from the Choctaw, creating an independent nation with its own constitution and government. The 1856 Constitution differed little from the constitutions of American states, with a legislature, a governor, and a system of laws. They built schools and churches, roads and farms, and they maintained the institution of slavery, passing slave codes that protected owners' property rights and restricted the freedoms of enslaved people. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, more than 8,000 black men and women were enslaved in Indian Territory. They comprised 14% of the total population. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the Chickasaw Nation sided with the Confederacy. There was never any real doubt about which side they would choose. Slave-owning mixed bloods dominated the tribal government, and they harbored deep resentment toward the federal government that had forced them from their homeland. The Chickasaw Nation declared its independence in May 1861 and formally joined the Confederacy in July. They raised fighting units and contributed resources to the Confederate cause. A contemporary observer noted that this was the first time in history the Chickasaws have ever made war against an English-speaking people. Confederate General Stand Watie, a Cherokee, did not surrender until June 23, 1865, at Fort Towson, making him the last Confederate commander to lay down his arms. The war devastated Indian Territory. Minor but violent internal civil wars tore the region asunder, as factions within each tribe fought over the issue of slavery and sectional loyalty. Thousands of refugees flooded into the Chickasaw Nation from neighboring tribes, straining resources and spreading disease. Farms were abandoned, livestock scattered, and the fragile prosperity that the Chickasaw had built in their new homeland was largely destroyed. When the war ended, the federal government treated the 5 tribes as conquered enemies, regardless of whether individual members had supported the Union or the Confederacy. Summoned first to Fort Smith, Arkansas, in September 1865, and then to Washington in April 1866, the Chickasaw and Choctaw were forced to sign a new treaty that would reshape their nation. The Treaty of 1866 abolished slavery in the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations and required them to recognize the rights of their former slaves. The federal government demanded that the freedmen, as the formerly enslaved people were called, be granted full citizenship, with access to land and tribal resources. The treaty held $300,000 in trust, proceeds from the sale of Chickasaw and Choctaw Western lands, which would be used for the benefit of the freedmen if the tribes failed to adopt them as citizens. If the tribes refused, the government would remove the freedmen and use the money on their behalf. The Chickasaw refused. In November 1866, the Chickasaw legislature passed an act declaring it the unanimous desire of the legislature that the United States hold the Chickasaw share of the $300,000 for the benefit of the Chickasaw freedmen, and remove them beyond the limits of the Chickasaw Nation. They wanted the federal government to take their former slaves away, to make them someone else's problem. In 1868, they repeated this demand. In January 1873, under pressure, they passed an act that appeared to adopt the freedmen, but in 1876, they explicitly repudiated that adoption. The legislature's declaration was unmistakable. The Chickasaw people hereby refuse to accept or adopt the freedmen as citizens of the Chickasaw Nation, upon any terms or conditions whatever. The governor was requested to notify the department at Washington and to appoint 2 competent men to memorialize Congress to provide the means of the removal of the freedmen from the Chickasaw Nation. The federal government, for its part, never followed through on its treaty obligations. It did not remove the freedmen, nor did it use the trust money for their benefit. The Chickasaw freedmen were left in limbo, without citizenship in the Chickasaw Nation or the United States. They could not vote, could not hold office, could not access tribal resources. The Chickasaw refused to support any education for freedmen, while other tribes at least provided segregated schools. The Choctaw eventually granted citizenship rights to their freedmen in 1883, but the Chickasaw never adopted theirs. The government refused to carry out its responsibility of removing the freedmen as well, leaving them in helpless limbo. The people known as the Chickasaw freedmen had no country. They were not citizens of any nation until Oklahoma statehood in 1907, and they did not receive United States citizenship until Congress enacted the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924. Elvira Shoals lived through all of this. Jones died 2 or 3 years after the war, she told the reporter in 1917, and then she moved to a spot about a mile below Shawneetown, where she had lived ever since. She raised 6 children, but they had all died before her. She had 6 grandchildren, including a 22-year-old grandson who lived with her and helped tend her 20 acres of land. She had survived slavery, survived removal, survived the Civil War, survived the betrayal of Reconstruction, and survived into a new century that had brought her none of the promises that emancipation should have delivered. The reporter who interviewed her was impressed by her vitality. From her movements, he wrote, she would not be judged to be her 80 years and 10. She was in possession of all her mental faculties, able to recall details of her life stretching back nearly a century. She remembered George Colbert and the Tennessee River. She remembered the journey west and the places she had lived in Indian Territory. She remembered what it meant to be property, to be bought and sold, to be moved from place to place at the whim of her owners. And she knew what freedom was supposed to mean, even if she had never fully experienced it. Shortly after the interview was conducted, Elvira suffered a devastating loss. Her house burned down while she was visiting a neighbor, and she lost everything she owned. The reporter noted this with sympathy, adding it as a postscript to her remarkable story. But for Elvira, it must have felt like one more chapter in a life defined by dispossession. She had been taken from her home once before, carried across the Mississippi into a new land. She had watched her children die. She had waited for a citizenship that never came. And now, in her final years, fire had taken even the small material comforts she had managed to accumulate. The story of Elvira Shoals did not end with her death, whenever that occurred. Her descendants, and the descendants of thousands of other Chickasaw freedmen, continued to fight for the recognition they had been promised. When the Dawes Commission began enrolling members of the 5 tribes in the late 1890s, preparing for the allotment of tribal lands and the eventual dissolution of tribal governments, the freedmen were listed separately. They appeared on the Dawes rolls, but on different pages than the citizens by blood. Enrollment cards listed whether individuals were by blood, intermarriage, or freedmen. Although there was intermarriage between freedmen and Native Americans, the Dawes Commission typically enrolled people of mixed heritage as freedmen and indicated no blood relation to the tribe. The freedmen received smaller land allotments, 40 acres compared to the 320 acres that other citizens received. The Choctaw and Chickasaw Freedmen Treaty allowed these nations to limit freedmen to 40-acre allotments, in sharp contrast to other tribal members, including adopted whites, who received 320-acre allotments. And when Oklahoma became a state in 1907, the freedmen found themselves subject to the same Jim Crow laws that oppressed Black Americans throughout the South. Oklahoma entered the Union and established segregation laws separating the races. Many freedmen still considered themselves part of the communities where they lived, but the state classified them as colored and subjected them to all the indignities of second-class citizenship. The Chickasaw Nation never granted citizenship to its freedmen. To this day, the descendants of people like Elvira Shoals remain excluded from the tribe that once enslaved their ancestors. The Cherokee, after decades of litigation, finally recognized their freedmen as full citizens in 2017, when a federal judge ruled in their favor. The Seminole and Creek have taken partial steps toward inclusion. But the Chickasaw have maintained their refusal. Chickasaw citizenship is a matter of sovereignty and is clearly defined in the Chickasaw Constitution, Governor Bill Anoatubby stated in response to calls for inclusion. The descendants of the freedmen are not eligible. Using the same Dawes roll as the base roll for citizenship today, those whose ancestors appear on certain pages are eligible for citizenship, while those whose ancestors appear on the freedmen pages are not. Advocates for the freedmen point out the bitter irony of this position. The Chickasaw Nation today invokes the sovereignty guaranteed by treaties with the United States, including the very treaties that promised citizenship to the freedmen. They broke the treaty, they never gave citizenship to their freedmen. One Chickasaw freedman descendant told a reporter in 2022. So, up until statehood, Chickasaw freedmen had no country. They were never citizens of any nation. The 1866 treaty was supposed to create a new relationship between the Chickasaw and the people they had enslaved. Instead, it created a legacy of exclusion that persists into the 21st century. They want the United States to uphold the treaty, another descendant observed, but they do not want to uphold the treaty either. In July 2022, the United States Senate Committee on Indian Affairs held an unprecedented hearing on the rights of freedmen descendants. Representatives from the 5 tribes testified, along with freedmen advocates and federal officials. The Department of the Interior acknowledged that there remain issues to be resolved, but Assistant Secretary Brian Newland also made clear that the department relies on the tribes to determine their citizenship requirements. It is important to understand that there is no single or uniform law or treaty that applies to all freedmen, Newland testified. The freedmen provisions in each of the 1866 treaties differed in important respects. The hearing produced discussion but few solutions. The tribes maintained their positions and the freedmen remained excluded. The exclusion has real consequences. Freedmen descendants are denied access to tribal health care, housing assistance, education programs, and the economic benefits that flow from tribal gaming and other enterprises. Based on estimated current Chickasaw Nation population of 49,000, approximately 50,000 freedmen descendants would be registered in the tribe based on extrapolation of the Dawes enrollment. During the COVID-19 pandemic, some freedmen reported being denied vaccinations at Indian Health Service facilities because they were not recognized as tribal citizens. They live in some of the poorest parts of Oklahoma, on land that their ancestors helped to clear and cultivate, and they are treated as outsiders by the nations that once claimed to own them. When we think about the legacy of slavery in America, we tend to focus on the familiar geography of the plantation South, the cotton fields of Mississippi, and the auction blocks of Charleston. But slavery reached farther than those boundaries, into native nations that had been pushed west by the same forces of American expansion that would eventually threaten their own existence. The Chickasaw, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole all participated in the system of human bondage, and they all carried that system with them when they were forced onto the Trail of Tears. Elvira Shoals spent her entire life navigating the intersection of these histories. She was black in a nation that privileged native blood. She was a woman in a society that gave men control over property and politics. She was enslaved by people who were themselves facing dispossession and ethnic cleansing. Her story complicates simple narratives of victims and oppressors, of good guys and bad guys. George Colbert was a leader who fought to protect his people from American expansion, and he was also a slaveholder who exploited 150 human beings for his personal profit. Both of these things were true, and understanding the complexity is essential to understanding American history. The struggle of the Chickasaw freedmen continues because the questions at its heart have never been resolved. What does citizenship mean? Who gets to belong? What obligations do we owe to the people our ancestors wronged? These are questions that the Chickasaw Nation has not answered, and they are questions that the United States has largely avoided. The federal government made promises in 1866 that it never kept. It left the freedmen in limbo and walked away. The legacy of that abandonment is still being felt by the descendants of people like Elvira Shoals, who are still waiting more than 150 years later for the citizenship they were promised. In 1917, when Captain W.S. Ray met Elvira Shoals on the street in Idabel, Oklahoma, he saw a woman who had lived through more history than most people could imagine. She had been born into slavery under one of the most powerful men in the Chickasaw Nation. She had survived the Trail of Tears, the Civil War, and decades of broken promises. She had raised 6 children and buried them all. She had lost her home to fire and rebuilt her life on 20 acres of Oklahoma soil. And despite everything, she was hale and hearty, still telling her story to anyone who would listen. Elvira Shoals deserves to be remembered, not just as a victim of slavery or a survivor of removal, but as a witness to the full complexity of American history. She lived through the contradictions of a nation that proclaimed liberty while practicing bondage, that made treaties while planning betrayal, that freed the enslaved while denying them citizenship. Her life was shaped by forces beyond her control, by the decisions of men like George Colbert and Andrew Jackson, by the laws of nations that considered her property. But she was not just a passive recipient of history. She endured. She remembered. She testified. The story of Elvira Shoals is not over. Her descendants, and the descendants of thousands of other Chickasaw freedmen, are still fighting for recognition. They are still demanding that the promises made in 1866 be honored. They are still waiting for a citizenship that should have been theirs from the moment slavery ended. The Choctaw-Chickasaw Freedmen Association continues to educate, empower, and engage members through meetings, webinars, and advocacy. They study the language, culture, and history of the community from which they come, maintaining connections to land and tradition that stretch back generations. History does not end. It echoes forward through generations, shaping the lives of people who never chose to carry its burdens. Elvira Shoals carried those burdens for more than a century, and her descendants carry them still. The question now is whether the Chickasaw Nation and the United States will finally acknowledge what they owe, not just to the dead, but to the living, to the people who are still here, still waiting, still demanding to be seen. Eventually, one descendant told the Senate committee, "Right is going to come. It is going to become reality. These tribes cannot continue to do what they are doing, because what they are doing is wrong, and wrong is not going to prevail." That faith, that belief that justice will ultimately triumph, is perhaps the most enduring legacy of people like Elvira Shoals. She lived through injustice after injustice, loss after loss, betrayal after betrayal. And yet she survived. She raised her family. She tended her land. She told her story. In doing so, she left a record that challenges us to remember not just what was done, but what remains undone. The debt is still unpaid. The promise is still broken. And the descendants of Elvira Shoals are still waiting.